Yes, so welcome, a huge big welcome to Orkney Viking Week 2021 and to our speaker for tonight, Thusen, who is originally from Denmark but has lived in various corners of the world, including Bolivia and London. In Denmark, she has worked in journalism and in policy and in Moosgaard Museum, which some of you will know as a very interesting living museum in Denmark. In 2017, she moved to Orkney. That's when I got to know her. She came to Orkney to pursue her PhD studies with the University of the Highlands and Islands at the Institute for Northern Studies, where she's working on a very exciting PhD project to do with the potential in Orkney for Viking themed tourism. And since we in Orkney Time Travel are also trying to create Viking themed tourism and sustainable tourism, eco-friendly tourism and all that, and his interests and our interests and the Orkney Archaeology Society's interests are all overlapping in that respect. So in that sense, Annie is perfect for the Viking Festival, and I'm so glad to have you here, Annie. Fantastic. Yes, so with no further ado, I'll leave the floor to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Raggy. And I'm going to try the exciting screen sharing. And here we are. There we go. Okay then, so yeah, this is going to be quite a sideways approach really to the Vikings and the Viking heritage of Orkney, given that my concern is, as Raggy said, its role in Orkney's tourism, but I hope you're going to find it interesting anyway. So in general terms, if a tourist destination is lucky enough to have a Viking heritage, this is really a great competitive advantage for it in tourism terms, given how effective the Vikings are at stimulating the public imagination and appealing to a very broad audience, as attested to by their omnipresence in popular culture, both historically and today, as you can see here. So Denmark, where I come from, is a good example of a destination which has made rather extensive use of their Viking heritage. So the picture here that you can see is from the Viking ship museum in Roskilde. So that's built around 5 Viking ships on display, but it's also been turned into a much larger attraction with the addition of reconstructed ships that visitors can sail on, boat building workshops, Viking fighting camps, different exhibitions and so on. And Denmark also sees a number of Viking markets every year. So this photo is from one in Ribe, which is close to where I grew up. And we also have quite a lot of Viking living history museums, and obviously also a big Viking presence in irregular museums, like this exhibition in the Danish National Museum. So that's called Meet the Vikings. It was quite a controversial exhibition, this one, for reasons that are maybe obvious, but it was also one of the most successful in the history of the museum. Iceland is also an example of a destination which has used its Viking heritage really actively for tourism. And it's one that I find quite interesting because they've used their sagas a lot. So they use their intangible heritage. So there are saga heritage centers scattered across the country, lots of guided tours based around the Icelandic sagas, and places like Dýrafjörð that you see here in the West Shores is marketed really specifically on being where Gisla's saga, so one of the Icelandic sagas, plays out. Now, I don't know if there would be anybody in the audience without any prior knowledge of Orkney's Viking and Norse heritage, but in case there is, this is a really, really potted history. So Orkney became an earldom under Norway, we think around the 9th century. And this is an arrangement that formally ended in 1468, when the kingdom that was then at that stage, Norway and Denmark, pawned Orkney to Scotland as part of a marriage dowry. But the Norse period in Orkney is more generally considered to have ended around 1230 AD, when the last Orkney Earl of Norse descent, who was Earl John, as you can see there, was murdered. You can also see from this timeline why I tend to use the word Norse rather than Viking, because in Orkney the Viking period is often taken to denote the time up until around 1065 AD, when Earl Thorfinn II, died, and after that it's then called the late Norse period, although you can just use Norse for the entire period. But evidently, if you're talking to tourists, Viking is a rather more evocative term, right? In any case, my point is just that Orkney, like Iceland, like Denmark, has a Viking past and a really strong Norse heritage. So that includes monuments like the St. Magnus Cathedral that you can see here, which was commenced around 1137. It also includes really extraordinary archaeology from the Norse period, including several extensive settlements that have been excavated. Scotland's highest concentration of pagan Norse graves. Some of the biggest treasure hoards in the country have been found here. And also obviously the Orkneyinga Saga, which is written or rather assembled around 1200 AD and telling the story about the Earls of Orkney. If you went to the talk yesterday, Judith Jesch's talk, you know all about that now. But apart from a few very prominent aspects, like the cathedral, for instance, the Viking heritage doesn't yet play a very prominent role in Orkney's tourism compared to many other destinations. So if you take the Orkneyinga Saga, for instance, we do have an Orkneyinga Saga trail. We also have an Orkneyinga Saga center up here, but they're quite modest resources. So the Saga trail, I think, consists in about 10 interpretation boards, like the one you can see here. So they're just scattered around the archipelago. But it was established in the 2000s on grant funding, and there's no funding for upkeep. So the boards, as you can see, are not being maintained. And it's really a shame because it was originally part of a larger project, also I think with Iceland and other countries, and there was storytelling and other things involved to promote our Norse heritage more, but there's just not much of it left. And the Saga Center, again, it's a great resource. There's some good interpretation boards, there's a film, but it's small and it's unmanned, and it only actually exists because of the efforts of a local community council, the Orkney Community Council, which keeps it going. So my point is that although there are tourism resources related to the Orkneyinga Saga, they're quite minimal at the moment, and it's not something that neither private or public tourism providers seem to be prepared to invest in to any major degree. Another example is the tourist guide training in Orkney. So tourist guides play a really big role in Orkney's tourism. They're really important. According to the most recent numbers, almost a fifth of independent visitors to Orkney go on a guided tour, and well over half of cruise visitors go on shore excursions, which are almost always led by a local guide. Now, tourist guide training is offered locally through my institute, but the guides are not trained in Orkney's Viking sites, excepting the St. Magnus Cathedral again. So this is a quote from the leader of the tourist training program. This was part of my research, and what she explained was about the program that we concentrate mostly on Neolithic and wartime. Everything else is kind of additional. And the Viking element of Orkney's past is just something that's mentioned in passing. It's not a focus, just simply because there's so much Neolithic, so much visual Neolithic and so much visual wartime. And I think that statement is really interesting because he offers an explanation of why the Norse heritage is not prioritized as a tourism resource, because it's just simply overshadowed by other Orcadian heritage resources, which are just so much more visually impressive, right? Now, that doesn't have to be an issue from a touristic point of view. It's really normal branding strategy that a destination goes for a very consistent, a very clear image. And the Neolithic heritage in particular is a super strong brand for Orkney given its visual qualities. So you can see on these pictures here how the standing stones, especially from the Neolithic World Heritage Site in Orkney, are quite omnipresent in logos and artwork locally, and they are clearly really strong icons for Orkney. So what you see here are just a few examples. If you take a casual stroll down Kirkwall High Street, you can find many more, right? The problem comes that when a destination is branded so much on particular sites, those sites really become must-see attractions for visitors. And in Orkney, this has become a problem now because it's coupled with quite a dramatic increase in tourism, particularly in the last decade. So as you can see in this graph, for instance, the number of cruise visitors to Orkney has almost quadrupled between 2011 and 2019. Non-cruise visitor numbers have also gone up, but less dramatically. So I think they've gone up with about 35% between 2013 and 2019. So as you can imagine, this has really increased the pressure on the most popular attractions here. So that means not least the heart of Neolithic Orkney. And that's our World Heritage Site. Again, I'm just including this information for people who are not necessarily from Orkney. So a World Heritage Site consists of the 4 main elements that you see here. So that's the standing stones of Stennes, Ringelbrodka, Skarabray, and Maysow. So especially at the Ringelbrodka and Skarabray. So Ringelbrodka is a stone circle and henge, and Skarabray is a Neolithic settlement. So those two sites really have issues with erosion, and footfall is a big part of that. So that's a real threat to the future of the sites. And those kind of negative tourism impacts on key sites and areas in Orkney has started to create some concerns locally with how we might spread out the interest and therefore the impacts of our visitors better. So this is how it was formulated in the latest Orkney tourism strategy, and I may add the first ever Orkney tourism strategy. It said that to embrace growth, there's a clear necessity to both temporary and geographically disperse visitors to less visited attractions and areas. And this is really where Orkney's Viking heritage and my own research comes in. Because my PhD, I focused on the extent to which the Viking and Norse heritage of Orkney might be brought in to increase tourism dispersal across Orkney. So concretely, I considered 6 smaller Viking and Norse sites across Orkney to find out what challenges they might face as visitor resources, and also whether and how those challenges might potentially be overcome. So as you can see here, the sites were reasonably well spread out. So there are 2 on the Orkney mainland, there's 2 on the inner North Isles and 2 on the outer North Isles. So on the mainland, we have a 10th to 12th century settlement and chapel on the Orkneyinga, probably a chiefly stronghold, and there's the Earl's Brew and the round church at Orfa, which are remains of a big Norse earldom estate. Inner North Isles, I considered a few different sites together at Westness and Rousey. So one of them is the excavation of a Norse hall at Scale Farm. They're excavating different sites, but they found this big Norse hall in 2019. But there are also a Pictish Norse cemetery with a nearby Norse boathouse and a farmstead, also at Westness. And there's also a tower house, a tower structure, presumed 12th century at Westness. And on Egilsey, there's a St. Magnus Church, which is a 12th century church dedicated to Orkney's patron saint. And on the outer North Isles, there's Croygu at Westry, which is a non-elite settlement, continuously inhabited from the 10th to the 20th century. And on Papua Westry, there's a St. Boniface Church. So that's a 12th century church, but it's built on a Pictish ecclesiastical site. And it's also actually still in ecumenical use today. Now, all those sites, obviously, they differ a lot in their challenges and in their opportunities as tourist resources. But I'm going to talk about 3 different key concerns which affected most of them to a greater or lesser degree. That's accessibility, supporting tourism infrastructure, and physical remains. So we're going to start with accessibility because this is basic, but it's really crucial. So you should think of accessibility as a product of location plus transport infrastructure, right? So let's look at the Harder Neolithic first, Harder Neolithic Orkney first, just to have a kind of base for comparison. So if we look at location, that's located in the West Orkney mainland, which means it's pretty close to the main tourism nodes in Orkney, which is to say the places where the tourist transport hubs are, most of the accommodation, the catering, and all the other tourism services. So in this case, that's the main towns of Kirkwall and to some extent Stromness. So they're in a good location. Road infrastructure is appropriate for cars and it's appropriate for coaches. So that means it's good for independent visitors and it's good for shore excursions, which are usually in coaches, at least the ones from the large cruise liners. So again, this is very good. Public transport infrastructure is very good in the high season because they're frequent and very handy tourist buses, the T11, although that is rather pricey, so that is also a concern. Not so good outside of the season, especially not for Skarabray, which has a terrible bus connection. But then if you go on to look at the 2 mainland North sites I was looking at, the location, west and east mainland, also very good. The sites are very conveniently located, especially Earl's Brew and the Round Church, which is just between Stromness and Kirkwall. Orkneyinga, more peripheral, as it at the easternmost tip of the Orkney mainland, but still only about 20 kilometers from Kirkwall, so still good. Road infrastructure, it's good for coaches, good for cars, not so good for coaches. So it's good too, it's no problem for independent visitors, not so great for coach-based shore excursions. And it's because those 2 sites, like countless sites of interest in Orkney are accessed via small single-track roads. At the Earl's Brew, it's also quite difficult for coaches to park. And the Brocha DNS, there's the issue that you additionally have to walk quite a considerable distance to get to the archaeological site. And I understand from tour organizers, if you have 30 to 50 people, that's not great. That's not a good situation to be in. And that is quite important when you talk about using sites for tourism dispersal, because the cruise liner groups is at the moment the main concern at sites like the heart of Neolithic Orkney, because they're typically big groups and they're concentrated within a very short season. So roughly 75% of the liners call between June and August. And because of those circumstances, they do play quite a significant role in terms of, for instance, the erosion. So it would be nice to have them spread out a bit more. And the public transport infrastructure, there are buses to each of those two sites about 4 times a day, most days. But the bus stop is in both cases so far from the site that you have to add an hour of walking to your total transport time. Some people will be fine with this, they'll enjoy the walk, but it does restrict your potential, the potential of those sites as dispersal sites, because you can only attract people who, for one thing, have plenty of time, and also who like to walk, have a certain level of physical fitness and a taste for exercise, and also are prepared to plan the day around bus timetables. So you limit your audience, right? So already here, accessibility is significantly lower than for the World Heritage Site. And then if you consider the sites in the small islands, first we have the 2 sites on Rousey and Egglesey, the Inner North Isles. Those islands are close to the Orkney mainland, but you still have to first get to Tynwald on the mainland, and then from there get onto a ferry. This is a procedure that takes time, it takes money, and it takes effort. Again, some tourists are very happy to invest all 3 things, but again, you seriously limit your field. And you can see that if you look at this graph. This is a graph over the percentage of non-cruise visitors to have visited each of my 6 case study sites area, as well as Kirkwall 2017. And it clearly shows how dramatically more difficult it is to get people to go to one of the small islands compared to the different areas of the Orkney mainland. But as I said, accessibility is a result of location plus transport infrastructure, and you can't just blame location for the low visitation numbers to the islands. It also has to do with road and ferry infrastructure, because again, there are limitations for coaches and shore excursions here. So the coaches, for instance, do occasionally go to Rousey, but it's really rare. And one of the reasons for that is that it's really difficult to get even a medium coach onto the ferry. It can't take the big ones at all. So it's just not convenient. I also have to say that the island residents on Rousey, not very impressed with the coaches taking up the entire ferry and with blocking the 1-track road they have on the island when they get there. So with the current infrastructure, it's just not very likely, probably not very desirable either, that coach-based shore excursions to Rousey should increase. Also on a more general note, the ferry serving Rousey and Egglesey is routinely overbooked throughout the summer, especially with vehicles. So even if more visitors wanted to go, they may not be able to. Going as a foot passenger would for most people not be a problem to Egglesey, which is a small island and you could easily get around there. You could easily go to St. Magnus Church and to the other attractions there. But for Rousey, it's very difficult because it's much bigger and there's only one weekly bus and there aren't really any real taxi services. So you can see how the sites on the Inner North Isles are challenged on accessibility, and it's the same for the Outer North Isles. So here, in terms of location, we're even further from the main tourism nodes, which are on the Orkney mainland. But it also becomes very apparent that accessibility is really both a question of location and transport infrastructure, because there are not only ferries, but also flights to the Outer Isles. So you can actually reach them much faster from Kirkwall than you can the Inner Isles, although you're at the expense of not bringing a vehicle. And in fact, you can see that there are no clear patterns if you go back to this graph of the Inner Isles being more popular than the Outer or vice versa. In terms of the shore excursions, obviously a cruise liner berthing at mainland Orkney, which more than 95% of them generally do, only a few go to the other isles. They don't have time to take a shore excursion to the Outer Isles. It's just not realistic in a day. However, as I say, a few times a year, smaller liners will anchor off or berth directly at Westry or Papua Westry or some of the other isles. And this does actually have interesting prospects for cruise line dispersal, which I'm going to come back to later. Otherwise, there are also a number of challenges with inter-island transport infrastructure to these two islands. So ferries to and from Westbury are frequent, but again, very often overbooked, especially in the summer season. Kirkwall to Papa Westbury, there are only direct ferries a couple of times a week. Otherwise, you have to take the ferry to Westbury, go on the community bus to the other end of the island, and then take a passenger ferry to Westbury. And this, unfortunately, is not really properly communicated in the ferry company's timetables or on their website. It's easy enough for Orcadians to navigate in, but it becomes another hurdle for visitors to jump. And the flights, again, tend to be overbooked in the season. So you can see that the tourism potential of the case study sites are really clearly challenged by this a number of accessibility circumstances which really lower their potential audiences. This doesn't have anything directly to do with the Norse nature of the sites. Accessibility is just a general problem for tourism dispersal in Orkney. It just happens also to affect these sites. Then we get on to supporting tourism infrastructure, which was the second key concern that I wanted to talk about in terms of the case study sites. So visiting historical and archaeological sites has become a mainstream tourism activity nowadays, but most visitors just seem to tend to consume the monuments themselves very quickly. So unless they have an expert interest in that particular monument, they'll generally sort of look at it, walk around in it, if that's possible, skim an interpretation point and kind of be done, right? So to attract and maintain interest from this sort of wide but not too specialized heritage audience, sites depend on additional facilities like reconstructions, guided tours, interpretation centers, museum shops, cafes, and so on. Now, the heart of Neolithic Orkney has all of this. Ring of Blood and Stones of Stennis are very natural sites, but they do have ranges that give guided tours in the season. Mace House Scarabray has shops. Mace House is only accessible by guided tours, and Scarabray has site reconstructions and a cafe. So this is the interior, for instance, of the reconstructed hut at Scarabray that visitors can enter and interact with. Whereas the Norse sites that I looked at were none of them staffed, which already really limits the options of supporting tourism infrastructure. It means no ranges, no shops, no cafes. In most cases, all that was interpretation boards, sometimes not even that. And this is especially a problem because of the low accessibility that I just talked about. Because the more peripheral a location a site is in, the more it kind of needs those extra facilities that justifies longer or more difficult travel. Obviously, this differed a lot between the sites. So for instance, the open excavation that I talked about at Scale Farm and Rousey did actually have on-site guides during excavation season because the archaeologists working there would guide it. And that added enormously to its attractiveness because it added to the time visitors could spend on site and the degree to which they could interact with it because they could interact with the archaeologists, right? And also the two mainland sites did have small interpretation centers. So there in the middle, you can see a bit of the infamous Orkneyinga genealogy board from the Orkneyinga Saga Centre, which is at the Earl's Boo. And also the other picture you can see is from a visitor centre, an interpretation centre, which is not far from Orkneyinga. So those sites were in a better situation in terms of supporting tourism infrastructure than the other case study sites, but still at a disadvantage relative to Orkney's more popular sites. Finally, the Viking Norse sites were challenged on the actual physical remains on site. So in a tourism context, you can say there were two major problems with those. First, for most visitors, the more that's left of the structures, the easier it is for visitors to envision and connect the site to the lived life and the people of the past and sort of get a meaningful experience out of it. At the same time, tourism is just in many ways quite a visual activity, and the more complete and the more imposing the structures are, the more there's for people to see and to photograph, right? It's as simple as that. Now, as I said in the beginning, Orkney's Norse archaeology is quite extraordinary, but a lot of it is also graves and treasure troves, and that gives you incredible artifacts, but it doesn't necessarily give you incredible sites. The artifacts are valuable for tourism as well, especially when we're allowed to keep them in Orkney, and they're in the Orkney Museum, for instance. But you can't so easily disperse people out to incredible Norse sites where there's nothing to see. And this photo is an example in point, actually. It shows, as far as I could locate it, the Pictures Viking Cemetery at Westness, where some absolutely incredible graves and grave gifts have been found. and which also has actually really added to an ongoing discussion about the interaction between the Picts and the Vikings. So many of you will know this. There have been scholars that have made the argument that when the Vikings arrived in Orkney, they committed and practiced genocide on the resident Picts. And other scholars have argued, well, actually, it was a much more gradual transition. So this has been a very heated, very interesting discussion, and one in which this cemetery has played quite an important role. So in every way, a very fascinating archaeological site, but considered as a tourist site, there's just literally nothing there. Okay, and that's emblematic of many of Orkney's important Norse sites, important Norse excavations. Then we have the settlement sites, of which there's also a number in Orkney. So here you can see some remains, but again, without good supporting tourism infrastructure, they're also a hard sell because they don't give you imagination a lot to work with, as you can see in and of themselves. They're not that visually stunning either. So for visitors without an expert interest or a very good guide, I mean, it can easily just be a bit of wall, right? Now, there are also some of the Norse sites, especially the church sites, that are more complete monuments. And this is absolutely an advantage from a tourism point of view. So St. Boniface Church, for instance, you can actually go inside it. You can also see some of the reconstructed 18th century furnishings, as you can see in the photo there. And St. Magnus Church as well, although the roof is missing, still quite a visually impressive building. But that brings us back to the second issue with the Norse sites, even those with more complete remains, and that is that it can be quite difficult sometimes to find their unique selling point, which is really quite important if you want to raise a site's tourism profile. So I found it formulated like this in a book on heritage tourism. And the author said that a temple is a temple is a temple unless it offers something unique or unusual for the tourist that entices a visit. Now, I'm on quite thin ice here because uniqueness is always really in the eyes of the beholder. So I know, for instance, that some years ago, somebody went to St. Boniface just to see this particular white cross in the churchyard, which commemorates sailors that went down with a Swedish ship just off the island's coast in 2016. And for somebody like that, obviously, this churchyard and this church is absolutely unique. And there are also many religious groups that find St. Magnus Church and to be a really, really unique religious site of great religious importance because of their connection to the martyrdom of St. Magnus. So he's believed to have been killed either where the church stands now or close nearby where this cenotaph that you can see here stands. But my point is more that to play a significant role in tourism dispersal, the sort of uniqueness or the unique selling point has to be one with a relatively wide appeal. And that's kind of what those sites arguably lack. So those are some of the major reasons in terms of accessibility, supporting tourism infrastructure and physical remains, which prevent some of Orkney's under-visited Norse heritage sites from attracting more visitors. But obviously what is even more interesting is to look at whether anything might be done to overcome those challenges. So if we look at accessibility first, two big issues came up. So that was the inter-island transport capacity and the limitations on coach and shore excursion accessibility to the smaller sites. Again, as I said, those are not particular to the North sites, they're just relevant to them as well as to tourism dispersal more generally. So in terms of the inter-island transport capacity, the good news is that this is something there is considerable awareness of in Orkney, and there's certainly efforts to address it, right? So anyone in the audience living in Orkney will know that there has been discussions for well over 10 years, I don't know how long, about replacing the inter-island ferries, which are from the 1980s and 1990. But the local council and the Scottish government can't quite agree on who should pay for what. So this has rather hampered proceedings. However, work is ongoing, and there's certainly an awareness that a new fleet will either need more capacity or a higher speed, which will allow for extended timetables on the routes that are considered here. In terms of the planes, there might also be opportunities ahead. So the capacity problems in terms of planes is that there are only 2 inter-island planes serving the Orkney routes. If there were more, it would be possible to extend the timetables. Apparently they do have the pilot hours to do that. They just don't have the aircrafts. Again, a third plane has been up for discussion. Nobody can agree on who should pay for it. So, but Loganair who's responsible for the Untitled route, is part of a research project with Cranfield University, which is set to test a hydrogen fuel cell powered plane on the Orkneyinga Untitled routes, hopefully by autumn next year. And at least the local air representative that I spoke to thought that if this is successful, then that hydrogen plane could become a permanent addition to the Orkney fleet. So at least in the longer term, there might be plans to improve the Untitled transport capacity, which in terms of visitor dispersal could be really significant. So the second issue of accessibility was that the Norse sites were generally difficult to access for shore excursions, certainly the coach-based ones. For some, because of the road and ferry infrastructure that is inappropriate. And for some of them, especially on the outer North Isles, it's just more a question of location, really, given that almost all cruise ships berth at the Orkney Mainland. Now, location is not an easy thing to change, and while the ferry to Rousey might, as I just mentioned, get increased capacity in the future, I didn't find any indications whatsoever that an extension of Orkney's road infrastructure to create more two-track roads is on the cards. However, it might be an idea not only to look at supply, but also demand when it comes to cruise tourism. So Orkney has already done that to some extent. So they introduced a cap of maximum 4,500 cruise passengers per day back in 2017. But you could also think about introducing a cap on individual liner size, or alternatively a progressive taxation system, so that the more passengers they have, the higher tax they would need to pay. So that could be our version of the tourist tax, for instance. So in that way, you could manipulate the demand to get few of the larger liners and more of the smaller ones. It's important to understand here that a cruise line in the context of Orkney can be anything from 50 passengers to 4,500 passengers, sorry. But in terms of dispersal, the smaller liners are just a much more interesting proposition than the bigger ones, because first of all, the shore excursions have fewer people. So they typically use minibuses rather than the coaches. And that means, and they also have more adventurous audiences. So, they can go to many more places. Also, if you have smaller ships, a higher percentage is likely to go to the small islands, because that's actually possible for them. And also, according to the shore excursion companies, this is something that the boutique liners, that the smaller liners are quite interested in. So that might be something to think about, although obviously there are other sustainability concerns than dispersal to take into consideration when you make such decisions. So much about accessibility. Then we get to the lack of supporting tourism infrastructure at the North sites. As I said, it is a key issue that the sites are not staffed, but I think it is something that is unlikely to change, certainly for the sites I looked at, not least because of the circumstances of their ownership. Some of them are owned by the farmers who own the land that they're on. Evidently, they don't have the funds to invest in staff or the supporting tourism infrastructure for the sites, nor is it very clear why they should want to do so. Other sites are owned by Orkney Islands Council. They might want to make such investments, but they don't have the funds. That was, for instance, the case at the Bochodernes. I spoke to the managers of the local nature reserve in which the monument sits, and they have had dreams of having a ranger, having a campsite, having a little shop. But even if all else were equal, the council doesn't have the money to invest in that kind of thing. Then we have the sites which are owned and managed by Historic Environment Scotland. That is an organisation that potentially has both the interest and the funds to develop sites. And I think there might be some opportunity at those two sites, Earl's Boo and Round Church and St. Magnus Church. However, when I did speak to the organisation's representatives up here, they told me that they had not in recent times reviewed their unstaffed sites in Orkney in terms of development possibilities. So they just couldn't really give me their stance on that. They were definitely concerned with dispersal. They were concerned with easing the pressure on the World Heritage sites. But it was not my impression that they're looking to the North sites for doing that they're looking to the unstaffed sites. They're much more concerned with dispersing people to Earls and Bishops' palaces, Bochodernes, which are sites that are already staffed. So I don't see much development in terms of supporting tourism infrastructure at the North sites. Physical remains. Well, there's not much you can do about the physical remains on the sites, usually. they are what they are, except in cases where further excavation and consolidation can be maybe taking place. And that's why I actually included this quote. So that is something that an archaeologist said to me in connection with Earlsbourne and the Round Church. I find it quite interesting in this context. So what the archaeologist said was that the Norse heritage and promoting it is difficult because it's just so much part of the landscape, because people, and by that she meant Norse people, are living where we live now, people are worshipping where we worship now, and people are buried where we bury it now. And it's interesting because Earlsbourne is a good example of a site that could really benefit from further excavation. We know from geophysical surveys, small trench excavations and so on, that there's just a massive site there underground. It was a really big earldom estate. Those of you that are going to go on the guided tour with Colleen or attending her talk is going to get an excellent introduction to all of that. So it's a bit more PR for Viking Week there. But you can't see much evidence of this big estate overground, which is why as a tourist site, Earlsbourne is not that effective. It's difficult to convey that impression of a big estate. But part of what makes potential further excavation of it really tricky is that not only is a lot of that former earldom estate now covered by an active churchyard, so obviously you can't excavate that, but there are also houses immediately next to the site, and there's extensive farming going on there. So even if you might excavate in some of those areas, those excavations that you can't just consolidate and open up to visitors, because just as the archaeology said, there are people living there and there are people working there, right? So yeah, you can't really make it into a bigger visitor site. And yes, the archaeologist also said that's quite typical of the Norse sites, and it's another thing that makes it difficult to develop them as tourist attractions. So to sum up, I think I would say that improved accessibility is a prerequisite for more tourism dispersal to Orkney's Norse sites. And it could convince a greater proportion of special interest visitors to go to those sites. But I think it's also quite clear that the Norse sites are unlikely to compete with, for instance, the World Heritage Monuments over the more general interest visitors, because the key monuments, the World Heritage Monuments, for instance, are just not only more accessible, they just also have better tourism infrastructure and more impressive remains. And those aspects are just unlikely to change, frankly. It's just an unsatisfying note to end on, because the fact remains that the Norse heritage in Orkney is unique. It is quite extraordinary in terms of the archaeology, the place names, the Orkneyinga Saga. It's just that so much of this is intangible, or it's hidden underground, or in some cases, in terms of the artifacts, for instance, it's been moved out of Orkney. So in tourism terms, this all just amounts to the same thing. It has no sightseeing potential. So I think that means if you want to utilize it, you need to put together tourism offers that's based on a different approach than sightseeing, which leads us to this, the so-called creative tourism, which is defined here as travel directed towards an engaged and authentic experience with participative learning in the arts, heritage, or special character of a place. So some tourism providers in Orkney do use Viking heritage for creative and engaged tourism. And this Viking Week, I think, is an exemplary point. Of course, visitors obviously are invited to learn more about the Norse past by engaging in practical activities like spinning yarn or making linen. And I know, as Raggy said, that she has also led tours, for instance, to Earlsbourne, which has involved not just guiding the site, but also storytelling and Viking games and crafts and cooking and so on. And that obviously is the same principle. So you're adding the intangible Norse heritage to the tangible, and so you make it a participative and a very engaged experience. And I've also added some pictures here of the St. Magnus Way. So that's a modern pilgrimage route here in Orkney that covers the Orkney Mainland and Egilsey. And it's based on the martyrdom of St. Magnus and the subsequent movement of his body and relics. So this was not originally conceived of as a tourism resource, but it has been really successful as such. And it has an app, and it has some interpretation in the landscape, which includes historical information and some questions and reflection points. It has poetry and so on. And because it offers both physically and an emotionally and a spiritually engaged experience rather than sightseeing, that's also a different form of creative tourism, right? So I think those are some of the alternative tourism offers you can make using the Norse heritage, and which I think are increasingly appealing to a wide audience. And that's actually also what Visit Scotland says. So those are two quotes from the Visit Scotland Trends report from 2019. And they talk about the growing interest in engaged tourism, whether it be in terms of skills-based activities or spiritual engagement. So one says that travel today is increasingly motivated by gathering experiences. Hobbies, skills development, and unique opportunities are all growth areas. And the other one is about pilgrimage, and it says that it continues to be a driver of travel in many destinations, both in Scotland and around the world. So I think this looks like the most viable direction, probably, if you want to use the Norse heritage to create alternatives to the main sightseeing attractions here in Orkney. However, although we do have examples of providers using the Norse heritage in this way, it's still quite rare up here. And I've given here just a few suggestions as to why that might be the case. So first of all, many creative tourism offers take a lot of investment. So that goes for much of what I talked about in the beginning when I covered the Viking tourism in Denmark and Iceland. So living history museums and workshops and big reconstructions. In Iceland, they were even putting on a regular performance of a saga at one of the saga centers at one point. This is all great and it's engaging and it's creative, but it's not free, right? So small peripheral destinations like Orkney typically struggle to get big inward investments in tourism infrastructure. So something like this would probably have to come from ourselves, and that's difficult, right? We're a small community. Secondly, for many tourism providers, it's just not been really necessary to develop these kind of alternative tourism products because there have been these visually attractive sites on our doorstep, like the World Heritage Monuments, which have done a lot of work for us just by being amazing and ready to be photographed. So there's also really a need to realize that we must diversify the offer to protect these kind of sites. And I think that realization is actually constantly growing. And lastly, and also somewhat related, offering creative tourism products is more risky and difficult than offering a more conventional sightseeing product. You have to approach it very differently than what you're used to, probably have to learn some new skills. You're not sure what the visit uptake of something like that will be if it hasn't really been done for the destination before. So I think some investors, companies, guides, etc., might be quite hesitant to go into that field. I think that's also just a question of somebody doing it first. So for that reason, I'm very happy to be part of Viking Week and hopefully see it grow even more in the future to make other parts of the Orkney tourism sector more courageous. And on that happy note, I guess I'm done.
Thank you so much, Annie, for that fascinating insight into the problems and potential of Viking tourism in Orkney. My head is just reeling with ideas and questions and thoughts at the moment, and I see the chat box is also full of responses. I was just thinking, we are doing it. We're doing it right now, and this Viking festival, that's what we're doing. That's our community's response, because if we can't use the sites for all these reasons that you've outlined, or if we can't grow tourism sightseeing to the sites, and we don't want to excavate or don't have the money or costs to create new sites through excavation and display, then what we can do is have activities in the creative tourism approach. And that's what we in Orkney Time Travel are trying to do with our Viking feasts on the beach, which can be on any beach, or walking tours through the landscape with storytelling, or activities like tomorrow we're having a session on how to process flax for making rope and textiles, that kind of thing. So that doesn't really need a specific site, it is the activity. And then we do what the Icelanders do, that the whole of Orkney, its landscape and history, is the attraction, not a specific site. So by starting this Viking Week, and we are doing this together because many people in the Orkney community are involved in this Viking Week, we can continue to grow this intangible part of Orkney's Viking tourism. That was my soapbox. Now to the chat box, from soapbox to chat box. I'll have to scroll up here. There have been some comments and some questions. Yeah, I've got two comments from your PhD colleague here, Fleur Ward. Fleur says first regarding accessibility, or Fleur, if you're here, do you want to just speak instead of me reading your comment? If you're here, Fleur, unmute now. Maybe Fleur can't unmute. She says, regarding accessibility, joined up thinking between coach, bus and ferry companies is a problem. Timetables are rarely worked out compatibly. I know, Fleur, and the most annoying example is if you're wanting to see the runic inscriptions in Maeshowe and taking a bus from Kirkwall, the bus goes once an hour, the tours are once an hour, but the bus arrives 5 minutes after the start of the tour. And then Fleur also says further down, there's clear interest in Norse heritage, but the nature of archaeology is problematic in that full excavation means the removal or destruction of a site. So reconstruction and interpretation is key. Who can pay for this? Do you have any comments to Fleur, Annie?
Yes, if I could just first comment on the first bit. I was actually gonna put it, because that is a huge issue as well with the timetables and the booking, and especially also with the ferries, because it's very difficult that you can't book them online, and that is something that has come up a lot as well. And the reason I didn't put it into my presentation was that I made my presentation last month, and Orkney Ferries came out and said, "Oh, we're gonna do online booking. That's going to be possible by the end of August." I said, "Oh, I better not put it in because things are going to change." But obviously things haven't changed. but apparently that is something they're working on. But it's absolutely right what Fleur is saying, that what we should be doing is that all the transport companies should work together, and and somehow the timetables should be able to work together. And that's just something that we haven't been able to work on, but that is a huge issue. And yeah, transport connectivity in itself, that's just a massive problem.
And Fleur's second point was about excavating and displaying. Do you have any thoughts on that? You're muted, Annie.
Yeah, could you just repeat that point again?
Yes, she says that excavation is, or can be at least, a destructive process if you remove layers as you excavate, and it also costs money. So reconstruction and interpretation is key. Who can pay for this?
Yeah, I think that is, I mean, that is more an archaeological question, that the destruction of the sites, because I'm not an expert in that. Some other people will know that much more than I will. But I think it's interesting what I've looked at the, as I said, with the scale farm, that the excavation process in itself is a big tourist attraction. And that's something that's interesting as well. That's something that we can really, that we've been able to make so much of. Obviously, the Ness of Brodgar has now been the big attraction. But again, we should maybe think about whether we could disperse that a bit more, because we have so many excavations going on. So, they don't all have to go to the Ness, even though the Ness is incredible. But the other excavations are really interesting as well. And they have different, strengths and weaknesses. And again, that could be dispersed a bit more in that sense, because the other ones are fascinating.
On that note, Jean Kveberg follows up. Great to see you here, Jean. Hello. Jean says, have you considered augmented reality options like UIST recently released? And that's a University of the Islands Archaeology Institute project where two archaeologists did an augmented reality project. It's like Pokemon Go. So that's been tried also, for example, at Uppåkra in Sweden with great results. And if anyone wants to hear more about the US project, they can tune into the Orkney the UHI Archaeology Institute seminar series on the last Friday of October, where the UIST project will be presented. That was a little plug there. Okay, augmented reality. Have you considered that, Annie?
Absolutely, yeah. I think there's augmented reality and virtual reality. They're great, especially for sites where either a lot of the site is underground, so you can't see it, or where they're just very sparse remains. So those are great. Also, a third thing is just 3D printing that could be used a lot more for sites where you have with artifacts where you don't have the artifact anymore. So, for instance, at Westness, where they were saying the Westness spruce that wasn't there anymore. This is not my idea. So when I talked to Sarah Jane Gibbon, and she was telling about, well, yes, you don't have the brutes there anymore, which was the biggest grave found on that graveyard, but you could just have reconstructions and in the Heritage Centre, and then people could interact with that, and you can kind of, there's so many new possibilities we have with the new technologies we have, and absolutely yes, augmented reality as well, and virtual reality. Just for these kind of sites where where lots of it is hidden.
Yeah.
Hidden, absolutely.
I have some comments, or actually a discussion going on between Colleen Beatty and somebody who's operating under my name here in the chat. I think that's my husband. Colleen said she had to go. Are you still here, Colleen? No, I think Colleen had to go, but she wrote before she left, the apparent paucity of upstanding Norse building remains is less of an issue. It depends on your viewpoint, really. Can one compare the Ring of Brodgar or Skarabrae with St. Magnus, Egilsey or Earlsbu round church at Orfer? Transport issues are the same for all the sites, so the difference has to be how the sites are promoted, certainly on the mainland. Interpretation and site presentation is crucial. Orkney prides itself on its Scandinavian heritage, yet potentially it has a greater archaeological wealth than anywhere else in Orkney, even more than Shetland. I cannot stay for the questions, I'm afraid, but I do think these issues are important. And then the person who is using mine, that'll be my husband, Chris, says, that's what I was thinking, Colleen. I thought a site landscape anywhere can be made unique, can't it? It depends on what and how it's represented or marketed, or how the story is told, or does that just not hold with the majority of visitors? And then Colleen replied, I think once the overall landscape setting is brought into the explanation, the amount of visible stonework is less significant. As long as it looks like the foundations of a building, visitors of all backgrounds come to Orkney, all have an idea of what the Vikings were about, and the rape and pillage story is not strong once settlement begins. We don't have to talk down to visitors, do we? Stimulating their ideas is part of the skill of interpretation. Some good signage would be a wonderful bonus, though a challenge, not a reason to give up. That was a long discussion, but I think the gist of it is that we mustn't underestimate our visitors.
No, I mean, there will always be an audience for these sites, definitely. And marketing is very important. And it's also one of the aspects that I'm looking at. I don't think that marketing and interpretation, it can't work miracles. So it's never going to make, for some visits, like, you can't market a small site to have as much success as a big site with a big audience, because it just, for many people, it also is important that they can spend a certain amount of time on a site, because otherwise they don't want to spend the time traveling to it, if they can see it, as I said, if they can see it in 5 minutes, which people will, unless they have a specialized interest. They're not gonna they're not going to spend half an hour on the site if they don't have a special interest in it, and if it's not a particularly big site. You can do a lot with good interpretation. Good interpretation is extremely important. Marketing is extremely important, but the remains are important as well for the wide audience. So it is a mix of different factors, I would say. Yeah.
And the last thing that I have on the chat, oh, there's more messages coming. Sorry, not the last thing, but one thing I have on the chat from David is more of a philosophical question. I wonder if the lack of architecture by the Norse had to do with their lifestyle, as being more concerned with warfare and nature compared to today, where a lot of us are disconnected from nature.
I see that. Sorry, you fell out in the middle of it. Could you just go again?
I think I have
to find it in the chat because I can hear you probably, but could you just go?
I think he was suggesting that our lifestyle today is disconnected from nature, whereas the Viking lifestyle was closer to nature, and that this is reflected in the architecture or the lack of architecture. I wonder if it means lack of buildings.
Yeah, I don't think there was a lack of. Again, I'm not an archaeologist, so maybe I'm not in my right element here. I wouldn't think that there was a lack of buildings, but does he mean that they're not, that's why they're not standing anymore? I'm not sure.
I'm not quite sure what he meant either. I can imagine, for example, he might be thinking of turf buildings and timber buildings that are not preserved to a grand scale.
Yeah, because they were more natural.
Can we instead move to Nick Thake's comment here? HONO is strongly over promoted in Orkney marketing. If we wish to encourage guests to disperse to Viking sites, the marketing has to shift. On the transport aspect, we have opportunity to reassess our transport routes and needs as we shift to sustainable transport options in the coming years. That's an opportunity Orkney tourism can't afford to miss, and an opportunity to provide improved connections to alternative locations. Nick, are you here? Do you want to come in yourself in person?
Yeah, okay. Really just the heart of Neolithic Orkney and the Neolithic, if you like, has strongly been the focus of marketing for forever, really. I mean, if you look at the tours that were promoted in the 1960s and compare them to the tours that are still being promoted to the cruise ships in particular now, as the best options, they haven't really changed enormously. In that time, the scope of the number of sites, the understanding of Orkney's development and all the other aspects of historic culture in other eras have it's been an explosion of understanding of that. And but yet marketing, yes, I mean, as Annie showed at the beginning, the favoured logo still incorporates standing stones that everybody wants to use. That is still our pitch. And we then are surprised that so many people want to go and trek around the Ring of Brogger and want to go and touch a stone, want to go to Skara Brae. We actually have to change the way in which we change our offer and change how we promote it, Orkney and generally, if we wish other eras of our record and other aspects of our culture to become more interesting to visitors and encourage them to engage in those other areas. So I'm just saying, really, we need to roll back from promoting what has already been sold and which everybody expects to see from here, and use our marketing nous and our marketing spend to promote the alternatives that are here among the islands. And that includes the trips to the outer isles and the anywhere that isn't mainland, basically. Thank you.
I agree with that, but that's also why I think, but we need to have some good alternatives to offer. And that's why I was like talking in the end about, well, for instance, for the Norse, the sites are not strong enough alternatives. And that's why it's like, well, we have to, for instance, sort of work on the creative tourism offers for the Norse, because, you know, to offer people an alternative, you have to have something that's better, that they conceive of as better. And then the marketing will kind of have to follow that. That's kind of the sort of the discussion we were into before. I don't think often I don't think you can lead with the marketing, if that makes sense.
I agree. It has to be a component part of it, and it's a mix. It doesn't just have to be the sites. It can be the other aspect. You know, educating about Viking culture, its place in the Isles, and so forth, as part of the storytelling associated. You're a storytelling coming up. It is an opportunity to begin that transition through the telling of stories, and that would in turn, it's about a number of sites. I think not any single site. We don't have that blockbuster that site that we can say, but I mean, trying to take a group to St Magnus Kirk on Egglesey is a nightmare, and get them back safely in time. It's only really with a hard boat that you can do that. So, you know, transport can play a big part in that. The excitement of taking a boat from Kirkwall and going round Guernsey and talking about Svein and carrying on and going on to along the coast of Egglesey and telling more, along the coast of Rousey and telling more stories, and then coming back into Egglesey and visiting returning to Kirkwall and going to the cathedral. You know, that is a wonderful day out, particularly if you can find lunch somewhere in the middle there as well. So, you know, that we can design. That's why I talk about designing transport to support the storytelling and these other sites. That to me would be a very, very marketable tour to cruise ships. Certainly, if you had a boat that could take 30 people, something like that, that would sell out every single time a ship came in, and distribute that number of people off. If it was a half-day tour, you could probably do it twice. So, you know, that's what it's all about, is aspects like that. So there's a great value in the work you've done here, and in what you're saying. I think great practical value.
That's a fantastic idea, Nick. I know many tourist guides in Orkney have their own vehicles, usually 8-seater vehicles, but here's an idea for somebody to invest in a 30-seater boat and start that up.
It would be a winner, I'm sure.
And actually, it's an interesting point that you raise as well, in order of when you talk about the experiential value of the transport, because I hadn't time to raise that, but obviously something, just the 8-seater planes as well, that is an experience for many visitors as well. So it's not, the transport is not just a bad thing. It just has to, as Fleur also brought up easier, it just has to be more smooth. You know, there are too many hurdles at the moment to jump.
I think we'll have to end there, unfortunately, because we're kind of aiming for an hour, and now we're 7 minutes past. But this has been a very stimulating discussion involving Annie herself and archaeologists and tourist guides and people who are working in the tourism sector on the organizing side of things and in cruise. What a fantastic audience. So thank you so much to the whole audience, and thank you so much, Annie, for giving us these insights and sharing your PhD work with us. Coming up tomorrow, those of you who are in Orkney in person have an opportunity to visit the Borere Sheep with Jane Cooper. So see the festival program for how to book that and how to get there and so on. Sunday, as I said, there's flax working out at Mark Cook's house in Stennes. Hello, Mark, I can see you there. Also in person, but that one is already fully booked, I'm afraid. And then Sunday evening, we have Nikolai's Frenzel, Legal Customs in Orkneyinga Saga, looking at Orkneyinga Saga again. He's a student of Judith Jesches, and this is based on his master's research. So that's online at 7 o'clock on Sunday night. See you then.